far as halfway through the Second Great Awakening. The three Great Awakenings were periods of revival, predominantly within the Protestant church communities. And although they had their roots in the UK, most of the activity occurred in America. It was partly due to the fact that the people who sparked the ideas at the heart of the Great Awakenings ended up emigrating to America, and partly because once the revival took hold there, it began to accelerate very rapidly for a number of factors that we'll see in a moment. The three Great Awakenings, in some ways, are reminiscent of the Reformation era. And the Reformation era, you might remember, was the period in which Christianity had decided it was time to reform the predominant church of the day, which was the Catholic Church, at least in Western Europe. But the Great Awakenings were, in a very real sense, an attempt to... Oh, that's a very good idea. Yeah, thank you. The Great Awakenings were, in many ways, an attempt to reform Protestantism along the same lines, which is why the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Orthodox pretty much stayed out of it and just said, okay, we've got no skin in this game. We've got no stakes here. This is just some weird Protestant thing going on. We'll just sit back and watch. So, what was the first Great Awakening? Where did it come from? And how long did it last? The first Great Awakening lasted from 1730 to 1755, and it was a period of religious revival that originated in Protestant Europe. And it emerged from Scottish Presbyterianism. It reached the American colonies in 1730, and sometime after 1750, it had spread to Canada. And one of the interesting things about the First Great Awakening and the subsequent Great Awakenings was that they helped to break down racial barriers in America. And we'll see the reasons for that a bit later on. People found the Great Awakening very exciting for one key reason, that it popularised lay clergy. Lay clergy is untrained clergy. So the First Great Awakening popularised the idea that you didn't have to be a professionally trained preacher or minister or evangelist. Provided you had the sincerity and some decent Bible knowledge, you could just get up and start preaching and teaching to anybody. And the leaders of the First Great Awakening heavily criticised the established clergy. Ironically, of course, most of the leaders of the First Great Awakening were themselves properly qualified ministers or preachers or evangelists. They had degrees in religion, but they argued that these were not really necessary, and they encouraged people to become ministers in their own right, untrained ministers and clergy and evangelists. And this, of course, created significant divisions within churches, particularly those that weren't keen on the idea that anyone could become qualified to preach and teach and evangelize without actually having some kind of formal education on the subject. The First Great Awakening established the evangelical movement, which is a movement within Protestantism that grew up very rapidly and became the dominant Christian group in North America, as it still is today. The First Great Awakening was supported by the Presbyterians, the Dutch and German Reformed churches, and the Baptists. But it was opposed by the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Quakers, and non-Protestant churches. So obviously the Anglicans and the Lutherans had already established their own way of doing things. They were not interested in some kind of extra subset of Protestantism. They didn't see a need for further reformation. The Quakers were just quietly doing their own thing in a corner, trying not to be persecuted by the Puritans, very often failing in that. The Puritans really hated the Quakers. And other non-Protestant churches, some of them were simply doing their own thing again, and they just didn't see that they had any kind of stake in this. Catholics particularly just weren't interested. So what sparked the First Great Awakening? Well, there was a number of social and political and spiritual forces that all came together to create the soil that was fertile enough for the seeds of the First Great Awakening. And of course, as the Great Awakening continued to develop, it began to influence society and spirituality and politics in its turn, and so with the second and the third. So let's look at how the First Great Awakening really kicked off. It was a time of social and political change. There were two big issues that were present in the minds of the public: abolitionism, that is the abolition of slavery, and secularism, that is the rise of a non-religious society and the separation of church and state. The idea that the church and state are one, of course, had begun in the 4th century with Constantine, and it had been pretty much the given paradigm for centuries after that. Now, particularly in light of the Protestant Reformation, people were less comfortable with the idea that the church and the state should be united. Remember too, this is after the Enlightenment, a period in which rationalism and science came to the fore and became powerful drivers in society and even in politics. So now people are thinking, if church and state are separate, then what should the church look like? And what should the state look like? Well, the church will have to respond to what the state does and what society is doing. So the church begins to change in response to that. But the biggest question, of course, what does a non-church state look like? A secular state? Well, it has to be one that doesn't favour or follow or endorse any religion. And where do we get our idea of morals from then? What do we do here? How does the state deal with issues of religion when they arise, and issues of morality and so on and so forth? So secularism was seen as the big threat by Christians. It had threatened to take away the power of the church in politics and in affairs of the state. And secularism had become increasingly popular as the basis for the way a state should be governed. It also meant that there was a rise of rationalism. People began to think, hey, the Enlightenment gave us so many good ideas, and we were able to jettison a lot of silly superstitions and a lot of mythology and all this other nonsense that's held us back for a long time. Science is actually doing some good now, and people are even the average person on the street is able to understand some basic science, and the world becomes explicable in non-religious, non-spiritual terms, and rationalism becomes much more popular, and for the first time it's actually socially acceptable to say, well, I don't actually believe in personal God. I'm not a Christian. I'm not any kind of religion. I'm essentially an atheist. Or if you didn't want to go that far, you could become a deist. Now, the deists believe that there is a God or some kind of motive force out there, and it was responsible for creating the universe in some way. But whatever this thing is, it's not personal. You can't have a relationship with it. So deists say, well, there's something out there, and yeah, it's supernatural as far as we know, and it made all this stuff, but it doesn't take any interest in us, and it's not personal, and you can't interact with it, and it doesn't interact with us. And many of the founding fathers of the American colonies, and certainly of the American state, were themselves deists, like Thomas Jefferson and I think Thomas Paine as well. So they began to say, hey, there is another way of looking at the world that falls between theology and theism and atheism. There's deism, if you want to take that option. And of course, agnosticism starts to become popular as well. The idea that, well, there might be a God, there might not, but we honestly don't know, and frankly, it doesn't really matter. So the church began to be concerned by what they saw as a decline in spirituality. There was a need to fight back against this and say, okay, rationalism should not mean the end of Christianity. We need to, strengthen the things that remain, to wheel out a tired old phrase, and see what we can do to revive the church. This, of course, led to bursts of religious fervour and the perceived need for spiritual revival. And particularly important in this context was the idea of the virtue of public conviction. It was important to make known your faith, to tell people that you were a Christian, to demonstrate your faith through charity, through Christian witness. So living as a Christian, whatever that means to you, is not good enough. You must go out and be an active Christian, preach, perform works of charity, witness, be an outspoken Christian. And in all of this, there was a general feeling that the churches were still too authoritarian, in the same way that the Protestants had rebelled against the authoritarianism of the Catholic Church. Now many Protestants felt that their own Protestant churches were too authoritarian. So there becomes a movement towards a democratic, egalitarian ethos. There is a more even-handed way of doing things. There is an idea that people are actually equal in the eyes of God. This has implications, of course, for the role of women and slaves in society, and that gave a lot of people plenty to worry about. So the characteristics of the Great Awakening can be summarized as follows: revivalism, introspection, spiritual renewal, a deeply personalized faith, a rejection of deism, of Unitarianism, that is the belief that God is only one person, not three, that is central to our own belief system as Christadelphians, and the rejection of skepticism and rationalism. Unitarianism had actually started to get a bit of a revival itself, and you will find throughout the Great Awakenings, Unitarianism actually becomes stronger. First, second, third Great Awakening, arguably strongest in the second and third Great Awakenings, which is one of the reasons our community starts to emerge. And Unitarianism becomes such a threat to the mainstream churches that they become increasingly worried about it and try to stamp it out wherever they can, exclude people from their groups, from their colleges, from their teaching institutions who might be Unitarian or might have Unitarian leanings. And also there's some camaraderie between Unitarian churches that don't actually agree on other doctrines. There's a general sense that although we disagree with each other on some things, we're at least in the same Unitarian boat, much as the Trinitarians have their own little Trinitarian club. So there's actually a lot more interaction and cooperation between Unitarian churches and believers at this time. Conviction and conduct become very important. Piety, morality, egalitarianism, emancipation as the freedom, particularly of the slaves, and outward signs of inward grace, as they are called, demonstrating your faith, being known as a Christian by the way you act. Autonomy is very important to the leaders of the First Great Awakening. There is a rejection of institutionalized aspects of the church, like ritualism, sacramentalism, and hierarchy. And of course, this also leads to the idea that you don't have to be in a church to do church. You can just have a big tent out in a prairie somewhere, and as wherever the people are, that's where the church is. You can have a revival meeting outside in a field or in a town hall or some other public place. It really doesn't matter. And this, of course, becomes deeply concerning to the churches that own all the big church buildings that people are supposed to be coming to get religion and to do church in their traditional way. People aren't satisfied with that anymore. They want something more spontaneous, something that feels more authentic. And of course, there is aggressive evangelism. It's still a new country. It's still, America is still a bunch of colonies at this stage. It's not actually a nation. It's still ruled by the British. So there is a huge, still vast swathes of land completely untapped and plenty of people to talk to about Christianity. And so itinerant preachers spring up. There is lots of emotionalism. There's lots of people claiming personal revelation. There's a huge swell of spirituality that sweeps across the nation and carries Christianity with it into all of the four corners of the different colonies. So let's see where it all started. It begins with a guy called Theodorus Jacobus Frelinghuysen, who was a Dutch Reformed minister, lived from 1691 to 1747. His message was based on preaching, church discipline, and the need for constant reform of the church. And although he was in Europe, his ideas quickly spread to the Presbyterians in Britain and from there over to the American colonies. Gilbert Tennant was another leader of the First Great Awakening. He was a Presbyterian, lived 1703 to 1764. He compared anti-revival ministers to the Pharisees, and he caused a division of the colonial Presbyterian church that lasted for 16 years. And he later worked very hard for reunion. So he pushed this need again for revival and reform within the Protestant church. If we're not careful, we'll simply become what the Catholics became. And one of the most prominent and most, I hesitate to say, infamous figures of the First Great Awakening was a Puritan called Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758. Being a Puritan, Edwards' theology was uncompromisingly Calvinist. He affirmed predestination, so there's no free will. You're either predestined to heaven or hell. God already chose that before you were born, so you just have to hope that you're one of the lucky ones. Limited atonement. Atonement's not offered to everyone. It's restricted to the people God's already chosen. And unconditional election. God has already elected you to salvation. You didn't have to do anything, and no matter what you do, you can't lose your salvation, which again is very reassuring if you turn out to be one of the elect. He also preached post-millennialism, which is a doctrine that teaches the church will enjoy 1,000 years of peace and prosperity before the return of Christ. And during this time of peace and prosperity, Christian holiness will become generally pervasive throughout the world, although not universal. And Edwards believed this would start around the year 2000. And while Edwards was a passionate preacher, unlike many during the Great Awakening, he wasn't known for shouting or berating his congregations. A lot of people did in those days. Instead, he entreated them earnestly and sincerely. But despite this, his sermons could be utterly terrifying, and we'll find out the reason for that in a moment. He is particularly famous for a 7,000-word sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which regularly caused audience members to scream and faint and clutch at architecture for support. Next we have John Wesley, a co-founder of Methodism, 1703 to 1791. I don't know what was in the water around 1703, but my golly, it worked. Wesley was originally Anglican, but became a co-founder of Methodism, which began as a revival movement within the Church of England, but eventually became its own independent denomination. He was born in Great Britain, and he immigrated to the American colonies with his brother Charles in 1735, where he became a leader of the Great Awakening. John and Charles both rejected Calvinism and embraced Arminianism, which taught free will, unlimited atonement, and conditional election. And this put them at odds with the Anglican Church, which teaches a form of soft Calvinism that endorses most but not all of its core principles. And Wesley's teaching emphasised a life of Christian holiness, experiential, emotional religion, and moral responsibility. Before we go on, is anyone interested in sinners in the hands of an angry God? And what might have said? Okay. Feast your eyes on this. Quote, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hated venomous serpent is in ours. You have offended him infinitely more than ever a stubborn rebel did his prince, and yet it is nothing but his hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment." That's an excerpt from Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an angry God. It was pretty fruity stuff. And at least 2 people are known to have committed suicide after hearing his sermon, believing that they were irretrievably condemned. And one of those people was his own uncle. So Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788, the brother of John Wesley, co-founder of Methodism. Like John, Charles was originally Anglican but became a founder of Methodism after switching to Arminian rather than Calvinist beliefs, and became a leader of the Great Awakening. And Charles Wesley is known for writing lots of hymns. How many hymns? Does anyone know how many hymns? A bit more than 700? 6,500. Now, you're not going to tell me that he didn't start to skimp on the quality towards the end there. I mean, at that point, I would just have a big box of nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and I would just close my eyes and throw darts, I reckon, and just assemble verses from whatever they landed on. But yeah, his output was phenomenal, and there's some of his hymns in our Green Hymn Book today. George Whitefield, a Methodist, 1714 to 1770. He, again, was originally Anglican, but he became another founder of the Methodist Church. He was known for his vigorous debates and disputes with other members of the clergy that made him very controversial, but he did attract large audiences, and he preached on at least 18,000 different occasions. So he was very popular, very well known, very influential. James Davenport, a Congregationalist, 1716 to 1757, another controversial preacher, and he was also famous for his verbal attacks on fellow clergy, but he was particularly noted for what he called the bonfires of the vanities. And these were public events at which people were encouraged to burn immoral books and luxury items such as cloaks, wigs, jewellery, and fine clothing. And although this kind of thing went over very well with his followers, the general public was less enthusiastic. In 1742, he was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. The judge declared him, quote, disturbed in the rational faculties of his mind and suffering from, quote, enthusiastical impressions and impulses, which he quite clearly was. The following year, 1743, at another bonfire event, he became so excited that he removed his own trousers and threw them into the fire. A woman in the crowd quickly seized them, returned them to him, and told him to get a hold of himself and put them back on, which he did. That was something of a PR disaster. So in 1744, he issued a retraction claiming that he had been possessed by, quote, demonic spirits at the time. But as you can guess, that didn't really improve his credibility. Samuel Davies, 1723 to 1761, a Presbyterian. Davies was a strong advocate for civil and religious liberties, and he became a powerful force for religious reform in the colony of Virginia, where he laid the groundwork for the separation of church and state that became Virginian law in 1776. At some point, both he and his wife caught tuberculosis and suffered terribly. His wife actually died, and Davies himself narrowly escaped. And this inspired him to commence a preaching ministry. Davies owned 2 slaves. This was considered acceptable because the Presbyterian church said that slavery was a matter for the state and not the church. So if you're a Presbyterian, you could own slaves, and that would not be any besmirchment of your standing in the church. But Davies wasn't really thrilled about the whole slavery thing anyway, so he treated them very kindly, and he taught that all slaves are the spiritual equals of their masters. This was obviously a very popular message within certain parts of the community and a very unpopular message within other parts. David also baptized hundreds of slaves as Christians and encouraged them to preach in his churches. And this is a major breakthrough. All of a sudden, slaves are being treated as spiritual equals. They can participate fully in the church, not only as members, but also as preachers. This is a very far-reaching idea for the 18th century, and obviously has great implications for what comes next. So let's look at the three churches that were divided by the Great Awakening. The Puritans were divided into two groups. The group calling themselves the New Lights and those who called themselves the Old Lights. Obviously, the Old Lights were the ones who resisted the Awakening. Presbyterians were divided, New Side versus Old Side, and the Baptists divided into separate versus regular. And those divisions remained pretty much permanent, and as they split off, these other groups basically formed their own subsets of Presbyterianism or Puritanism or the Baptist Church, or formed their own little denominations. Now we reach the Second Great Awakening, 1790 to 1840, and this was a great period in which emancipation and abolition of slavery becomes a much more topical issue and a much more powerful force socially and politically. The Second Great Awakening began in Tennessee and Kentucky among the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, which is not surprising considering what we've already seen. It resulted in a period of social reform and an emphasis on salvation by institutions, particularly charitable institutions run by the church. And it coincided with a population boom that pushed colonial expansion westward. So, of course, preachers and other evangelists all went westward to follow the colonists and to spread their message. And so Christianity was swept along with it. The Second Great Awakening rejected the excessive emotionalism of the First Great Awakening. They wanted something a bit more respectful, a little more sober. They thought maybe people have been jumping around and screaming a bit too much. Maybe we should all just settle down and just start thinking a little more clearly now. It led to the foundation of colleges and seminaries and missionary societies by Christians, many, if not most of which, are still with us today. And it united colonies and boosted church growth. And particularly, as we'll see, it sparked the emergence of fresh new sects and denominations. So, what are the characteristics of the Second Great Awakening? Adventism. Adventism was a movement that sprang up within Christianity that teaches the return of Christ is very close. Not just very close, but basically it's going to happen within our lifetime. And obviously this very often results in specific predictions about the date of Christ's return, and you can imagine how those panned out. Premillennialism becomes a big theme in the Second Great Awakening. Premillennialism is, of course, the original Bible teaching that the millennium occurs after Christ's return and not before it. And we have that documented not just in the Bible, but also in the earliest expositors of Scripture from the 2nd to 3rd century onwards, confirming that this is the original understanding of that message. Postmillennialism becomes resurgent and it actually becomes dominant during the Second Great Awakening, although premillennialism was hitting back pretty hard. Restorationism springs up. Restorationism is a movement, another reform movement within the Great Awakening that sought to abandon denominational labels, simplify church practices, and return to the unity of the first century church. Now, you'll often hear Restorationism described as a back to the Bible approach, which, yeah, it is, and or an attempt to recreate the first century today, the first century church today, which it really isn't. The only getting back to the first century aspect of Restorationism was the idea that we should become more unified than divided, that we should set aside all the labels and denominational names that we've built up and all the clutter over time, and that we should try to emulate the form of unity of fellowship that existed in the first century. And the leaders of Restorationism were typically opposed to creeds and statements of faith and anything that would actually tie Christianity down too much beyond biblical statements. They did not like human written creeds. They preferred to say, well, let's just define our beliefs purely with passages from Scripture and just, I guess, assume and hope that everyone understands them the same kind of way. Now, this was not a new idea. It had emerged during the Reformation era. The Polish Brethren had already done it. They laid out this method nice and clearly in the Rakovian Catechism, which is actually a statement of faith, but it's based on biblical statements. John Wycliffe did the same thing. He wrote a little statement of faith, which is literally just questions about doctrine, everyone answered with a quote from Scripture. So the idea was that man-made creeds have caused a lot of the problems that we see today within the church, the complications, the ever-expanding lists of doctrines, and the war about which doctrine is correct. And we should get back to the simplicity of the church, not teach what it doesn't say, always teach what it does say, and try not to speculate and bring in new elements. And this, of course, Restorationism became a founding theme of our own community with John Thomas and Robert Roberts. Although, of course, in time, even they began to see the need for a formalised statement of faith. There was one church that grew out of the Restorationist movement, which, well, as far as I'm aware, it's the longest one to resist a formal creed. That's the Seventh-day Adventists. They did not have an official statement of faith until the 1980s. I think it was around 1986. They were so opposed to the idea that they might be locked down to a document that could be used against each other or against other people, that they resisted a formal creed for that long. It was also, of course, complicated by the fact that their founder, Ellen White, was believed to have visions, and they were concerned that any document written down might later contradict what she was saying. So, of course, there was that difficulty as well. That is an interesting little side note. Dispensationalism emerges, of course, during the Second Great Awakening. This is an interpretive system developed by a guy called John Nelson Darby. It teaches that the history of creation is divided into 7 defined periods to which God has allocated specific administrative principles. Thus, the divine rules of one dispensation do not apply to the other. God had one set of rules for Eden, one set of rules for the Mosaic era, another set of rules for, say, the Abrahamic and Davidic eras, and so on and so forth, all the way up to the present day. Dispensationalism is premillennial and affirms a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, which is about the only thing dispensationalism gets right. Barton W. Stone, co-founder of the Restoration Movement, 1772 to 1844. Stone was a Presbyterian minister who resigned from the church after rejecting various doctrines based on Calvinism. And he created a movement that went by various different names, one of which was the Christian Connection. Stone was an abolitionist, a very outspoken abolitionist. He was utterly opposed to slavery and didn't care who knew it. He didn't actually own any slaves, but his wife had inherited 2 slaves from her mother-in-law. And Stone did not like this at all, so he moved the entire family from Kentucky to Illinois, where it was legal to free your slaves, and he did this solely for the purpose of freeing the slaves inherited by his wife. 1775 to 1783, the American Revolutionary War, otherwise known as the American War of Independence. This was sparked by colonial discontent over the heavy burden of taxation and laws imposed by the British government. Can anyone remember who the king is at this time in Britain? George III, correct? Yep. George III, who had problems of his own. He had a medical condition that was seriously disabling his mind, so he became known as Mad King George. And as you can expect, his government began to feel the effects of that as well, so that didn't really help matters. It became increasingly irrational as time went on. So Americans basically resented the fact that the Crown taxed them in America while denying them representation in the British Parliament. So their rallying cry became no taxation without representation. In 1765, the 13 American colonies rebelled, and the British responded with lethal force. And full-scale war had broken out by 1775. And then the following year, 1776, the colonies declared independence. France immediately sided with the Americans, began providing them with financial and military support, and started attacking the British. So the British now had to fight off France at the same time. Bear in mind, France is still a major European military power, has got some serious clout, and of course is a convenient hitting distance from Britain, which complicates matters for King George considerably. The American colonists, meanwhile, think, hey, Canada's next door. Maybe they'd like to join in and support us. So they went over to Canada, and the Canadians said, no, thanks, we're not interested. So the Americans invaded Canada and attacked them. But the Canadians said, well, we're loyal to the Crown, and they forced the Americans out. And those who were not killed or captured died of smallpox during the retreat, which was pretty catastrophic. In 1779, Spain realised that something interesting was happening over here and said, hey, I'd like to join in as well. So Britain goes, oh, that's great, because, I'm fighting France and the Americans at the moment. And Spain said, well, France is an ally of mine, so I will join this war on the side of France and the Americans. And Britain goes, oh, for nothing. So Britain is now fighting 13 colonies plus France plus Spain. So she's getting hit by all sides, and of course her king is mad. And none of this is particularly helpful to the war effort. And it's the support of France that ultimately proved decisive. And the Americans declare victory in 1783, and independence has not only been declared, but established and now successfully defended. But this leads to a question of what the new American state will look like. And as I said before, many of the founding fathers were deists, non-Christians, or at least Christians in name only. And the Declaration of Independence is strongly influenced by their views. Curiously, of course, their founding statements, including the Constitution. Anyone remember the most memorable statement, the most notable statement in these founding documents? All men are created equal. That's correct. Which, of course, the founding fathers politely ignored because they owned hundreds, sometimes thousands of slaves. So as far as they were concerned, all men are created equal did not include slaves. So obviously they had some fantastic cognitive disconnect going on there, by which they just sort of circumvented that in their brains, I don't know. But of course, slavery is essential to the economy by now. They don't have industrialization, certainly not full industrialization. The Industrial Revolution's only really kicked off in Britain. It's going to take a while to reach America. And in the meantime, slaves are free labor, and they're very productive, and it's cheap and it's easy. It's basically the same system that Rome had. You can't reform the economy unless you've got something to replace all that labor with. And of course, slaves being the cheapest option, why would you bother replacing them anyway? That becomes a critical issue a bit further down the track. So now we have William Miller, originally a Baptist and the founder of Adventism, 1782 to 1849. Miller became consumed with questions of faith and afterlife following his experience as a soldier in the War of 1812, which was a separate war from the War of Independence. And his study of the Bible led him to the conclusion that Jesus would return in 1843. And he arrived at this date by applying the day for a year principle to Daniel 8:14, which says the sanctuary will be cleansed after 2,300 days. And he calculated the beginning of this 2,300-day period from 457 BC, which is when Artaxerxes gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. He went public with his views in 1822 and began to attract a large following, who were known as the Millerites. And as the date of Christ's return approached, many of them sold their possessions in preparation of this, and Miller himself began to slightly revise his predictions. He now said that the return of Christ would occur sometime between March 1843 and March 1844. And then he subsequently revised this to April and then October. And when October 1844 passed without incident, which was a spectacular non-event that became known as, you're going to love this, the Great Disappointment, most of the Millerites, who now numbered in tens of thousands, actually abandoned Christianity. A few thousand joined minority churches. Hundreds joined new movements such as the Adventist Christian Church and later the Jehovah's Witnesses as they arose. And then a tiny remnant, numbering only in the dozens, established a new church known today by three letters, SDA. Seventh-day Adventists, that's correct. How did they recover from the Great Disappointment? How did they manage to think their way around it? Well, we'll see that in the next class. Finally, for tonight, we have Alexander Campbell, co-founder of the Restoration Movement, 1788 to 1866. Campbell was the son of a Presbyterian minister, Thomas Campbell, who had formed his own church after seceding from the Presbyterians. The birth of his first child caused Alexander to reconsider the practice of infant baptism, which he subsequently rejected. Then, in 1812, Thomas, Alexander and their wives were rebaptized by a Baptist preacher and went public with their declaration that infant baptism is definitely not doctrinal, not scriptural. He remained associated with the Baptists for some time, but eventually broke away to form his own group, which had various names, including Disciples of Christ and the Restoration Movement. He taught that doctrine should be based purely on Scripture rather than on traditional Christian creeds and confessions. And his group united with Barton Stone's, forming what became known as the Stone Campbell movement. And eventually the movement formalized and evolved into the Church of Christ, which is still around today and is, aside from the Church of God of the Abrahamic faith, one of the closest existing churches with some historical links to the Christadelphians, because of course John Thomas was a member of the Campbellite movement and came out of that as he began to develop his own ideas. So that takes us about halfway through the Second Great Awakening. I hope you found it informative, and we'll pick up next week and take it through to the third.